Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sam Anthony, and I am the director of the Author Lecture Program here. On behalf of the Archivists of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to the National Archives and Records Administration. We are honored today to have with us Dr. Alan Weinstein as he will discuss his book, The Haunted Wood, Soviet Espionage in America, the Stalin Era. A few points before we begin. Copies of the book will be for sale outside in the hallway. Following today's lecture, Dr. Weinstein will be signing copies of his book. If we have time, I believe we will, following his lecture, we will have a question and answer session with the audience. If you would like to have our calendar of events mailed to your home, there is a sign-up sheet also outside where books are being sold. We do still have some free calendars for June, also at the entrance of the theater. Well, why don't we get started? Historian Alan Weinstein is founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Democracy, a nonprofit foundation created in 1985 to promote and strengthen the democratic process. It's based in Washington, D.C. His international awards include the United Nations Peace Medal for efforts to promote peace, dialogue, and free elections in several critical parts of the world, the Council of Europe's Silver Medal twice in 1990 and 96, presented by its Parliamentary Assembly for outstanding assistance and guidance over many years. He was a university professor and professor of history at Boston University from 1985 to 1989, and he was university professor at Georgetown from 1981 to 1984. From 1966 to 1981, he was professor of history at Smith College and chairman of its American Studies program. Professor Weinstein's book include The Haunted Wood, the Hiss Chambers case, which received several citations, including the American Book Award nomination, Freedom and Crisis in American History, Between the Wars, American Foreign Policy from Versailles to Pearl Harbor, and Prelude to Populism, Origins of the Silver Issue. Would you please welcome Dr. Alan Weinstein.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony. I would just make one slight correction. The title of the Hiss Chambers book is Perjury, the Hiss Chambers Case. I want to thank the National Archives for inviting me to speak today, the latest in a series of programs here in which I've had the good fortune to be involved over the years. And I want to thank all of you for coming today, especially since the book I will be discussing for a portion of this hour is not hot off the press, but rather recently published in its paperback edition by Modern Library. So much of what I have to say may already be known to some of you. The timing of this talk about a book on Soviet espionage in the United States, however, has something to be said for itself. A former KGB officer now rules Russia by popular election. The President of the United States today or tomorrow is en route to Moscow to spend a weekend with the Russian president. And those who opened your Washington Post this morning found a lead editorial on U.S. policy toward Russia and a lead op-ed piece by a distinguished Russian media executive on threats to freedom of the media in that country, about all of which I will have something to say before the hour is over. And finally, I'll try to discipline myself not to use the entire hour in my prepared comments and to leave as much time as possible for questions or, for all I know, your prepared comments, whatever that may be. How did one come to write a book on Soviet espionage in the United States during this period? I could take all hour with a description of that, but the simplified version is that in 1993, my publisher, Random House, came to an agreement with the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, which was then headed by Yevgeny Primakov, who went on to become Foreign Minister and briefly Prime Minister of Russia, and purchased rights to access for several books to be done jointly by Western historians and Russians. In the case of my co-author, he was a former agent of the KGB who became a journalist, Alexander Vasilyev. Now, why did the KGB or the former KGB folks sell access to at least some access to their archives to an American publisher? I think most of you are familiar with the famous Willie Sutton line about robbing banks, because that's where the money is, and they needed the money very badly at that time. But it turned into an extremely interesting 2-year research experience in Moscow until those archives were again closed. It involved a number of meetings with Mr. Primakov and with various Soviet agents of an earlier period about which we can talk later, perhaps. First question, why the title? The phrase, The Haunted Wood, comes from a well-known poem by W.H. Auden, September 1, 1939, in which the relevant lines are these. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night who have never been happy or good. I use the title for this book because it seemed to encapsulate the moral confusions of many Americans who, fueled by romantic anti-fascist and pro-communist convictions, became spies for the Soviet Union, believing in a number of cases that they were not necessarily betraying their own country in doing so. This issue of Soviet espionage has, in recent months, again, fueled a certain amount of public debate. Some of you are familiar with a long article by Jacob Weisberg in a late November '99 issue of the New York Times Magazine under the heading "The Rehabilitation of Joe McCarthy," in which he described the continuing debate among scholars over the nature and meaning of Soviet espionage in America during the Depression and World War II. This article, I'll refer to some of the issues raised in this article. Recent studies by historians, often based on previously secret U.S. and Soviet intelligence files, have rekindled debate, in short, over interpreting those issues. At a similar moment in the life of Soviet scholarship a decade ago, at a meeting in Moscow of Russian and American historians in which I chaired the U.S. side, this was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, one young Russian scholar whispered to me about the manner in which his colleagues were confronting new Western scholarship, which shattered their earlier Cold War shibboleths. "You know, I live in a remarkable country, Alan. We can predict the future and understand the present perfectly, but the past keeps changing every day." The end of the Cold War has brought a significant measure of new evidence and reconsideration to the subject I want to cover today. So let me begin with some comments not only about my own book, but about this new history of Soviet espionage, as it has been called. Now, spy fiction always floods the literary marketplace, but in the past year, spy fact has raced to catch up. Specifically, our basic understanding of Cold War espionage in the United States and England has deepened with publication over the year and a half just past, of 4 overlapping books, each filling in a significant aspect of the research landscape. Their co-authors include 3 Americans, 3 Russians, and 2 Englishmen. The latest of these, The Sword and the Shield, written by Cambridge historian Christopher Andrew and former KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, drew major news stories with details about yet another Soviet agent working on atomic energy matters during World War II, in this case an 87-year-old Englishwoman who promptly acknowledged her involvement in the process. Andrew is a prolific scholar of modern intelligence, best known for a previous book on KGB history written with an earlier defector, Oleg Gordievsky, and he used in this current volume several thousand items copied over the years from the KGB archives by Mr. Mitrokhin before his retirement in 1984, material which he brought to England where he sought asylum. Another previously secret cache of documents, this one from American intelligence sources, was used skillfully in John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare's book Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America, as well as in the Weinstein-Vasiliev book. Clare and Haynes identified over 300 Soviet agents and sources in the United States during the 1930s and 40s, using the deciphered transcriptions of World War II Soviet intelligence cables assigned at the time the project name Venona, whose documents were released finally by the CIA and the NSA in 1995 and 96. A third study, published here last March by espionage expert Nigel West and another former KGB official, Oleg Sarov, called The Crown Jewels, the British Secrets at the Heart of the KGB Archives, was mainly focused on Soviet spying in England, but it did contain valuable material on such agents as the atomic spy Klaus Fuchs, who also operated in the United States, and finally, The Haunted Wood, Soviet Espionage in America, the Stalin Era, which I wrote with Mr. Vasiliev, who, like Mitrokhin, now lives in England, used extensively both Venona files and, for the first time, an array of KGB files on Soviet espionage in the United States, requested by the authors from the former KGB's Moscow archives. Now, what have we learned from all 4 books, each based on previously unavailable materials? In the case of Americans who provided information and documents to Soviet operatives during the 1930s and war years, they confirm with new evidence the involvement of such figures as Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Earl Browder, Julius Rosenberg, Lachlan Curry, White House aide Lachlan Curry, I might add, Lawrence Duggan, Theodore Hall, yet another atomic spy, and hundreds of others, according to the Haynes-Clare itemized count. And so we can now say with some assurance that Soviet spy networks were active throughout the U.S. government during these years, at the State Department, the Treasury, the War Department, among other agencies, at the supposedly top-secret Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, and at the super-secret Manhattan Project, then developing the atomic bomb. Although at most hundreds of the tens of thousands of open Communist Party members cooperated with Soviet agents, their efforts were aided, abetted, and led by the party's leader, Earl Browder, until he was unceremoniously dropped from membership in a post-war purge at Stalin's direct instructions. Other new evidence disputes the allegation made by a previous book that the great scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer assisted Soviet intelligence. Nor does Ethel Rosenberg, executed along with her husband in 1953 for supposed involvement in atomic espionage, emerge from the Venona and the KGB files as more than a witting, supportive wife, but probably not deeply involved or in a major way in Julius's covert efforts. The KGB files also document the link to Soviet operatives of a U.S. congressman, a Hollywood producer, the daughter of the U.S. ambassador to Nazi Germany, and other well-known figures. It's a book filled with love affairs, actual or plotted murders, agent business ventures, defections, many other dramatic episodes. I won't go into them all, except to suggest that, to the best of my knowledge, the only two figures I could find who actually worked for money for the Soviets as opposed to ideological conviction alone were a Hollywood producer and a U.S. congressman, and I leave you to draw your own conclusions from that. In short, there was an extensive effort to recruit Americans for espionage. It depended heavily on romantic anti-fascist and pro-communist ideologues during the pre-war and World War II periods. But basically, in the Cold War era, that effort shifted to recruitment for money and because of personal grievances, as Christopher Andrew and other studies demonstrate. But did Stalin and his few cohorts in top Soviet leadership use much of the valuable intelligence gained by the efforts of the KGB and military intelligence operatives in the US and Great Britain? The clearest case of crucial and immediate use involves transmission of data from the Manhattan Project obtained through the efforts of Julius Rosenberg, David Greenglass, Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, Harry Gold, and others. Although only the full release of Soviet archives can tell a complete story, existing scholarship has shown that the transfer of scientific and technical data from Western laboratories undoubtedly saved the Soviets several years in developing their own atomic weapons. Nor was it unimportant for the Soviet Union to have highly placed agents such as Alger Hiss, Kim Philby, Harry Dexter White, Donald McLean, and Lachlan Curry, transmitting up-to-date news of decisions from top U.S. and British policymakers directly to Moscow. However, we are not likely to increase soon our precise awareness of what use Stalin and others in the Kremlin made of such information since the KGB archives have been shut tight again. One reviewer of my book even argued that by and large, quoting him, Moscow gleaned more value from its open wartime alliance with Washington than by its secret underground rings. But the evidence to date in these 4 volumes alone can make a credible case for major harm inflicted by Moscow's agents. For example, if it were discovered today that among those providing classified information to a foreign government were a top presidential aide, leading officials at state, defense, and the CIA, and a member of Congress, among others, I think few Americans would question the significance of such espionage. Nor was national security less jeopardized by those Americans who worked for pay during the Cold War, even if in more modest posts. Thus, Matrokin's documents helped lead in 1996 to the arrest and conviction of Robert Lipka, who assisted the Soviets as a code clerk for the National Security Agency 30 years earlier, during the 1960s, and who had his sentencing 3 decades later for having betrayed his country exclaimed, "I feel like Rip Van Spy." One decisive conclusion emerges dramatically from several of these books, my own included. Throughout the 30s and 40s, the U.S. and British governments learned far more about Soviet espionage in their countries from the revelations of defectors than from their own inadequate counterintelligence efforts. Had Soviet code clerk Igor Gouzenko not defected to Canada in 1945. And that same year, Elizabeth Bentley not changed her role from Soviet courier to FBI informant, reinforcing Whittaker Chambers' earlier statements to the Bureau about communist espionage, we would never have gained an early, if still partial, understanding of Soviet spy rings in North America. Later Soviet operatives who defected to the West during the Cold War decades, among them Oleg Gordievsky and now Igor Matrokhin, also brought with them invaluable material and memories to flesh out the story of their services, efforts, and accomplishments in Western Europe and the United States. In Moscow, my own conversations with leading officials of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, which is the successor agency to the foreign intelligence work of the KGB, confirmed in the 90s both their still fierce anger at Mr. Gordievsky in particular, and by implication, the accuracy of the recollections he set down in his book with Christopher Andrew. Despite periodic counterintelligence successes during the Cold War decades, for once the belated identification and arrest of Aldrich Ames, the CIA has now recognized Mole. Despite this and the recent flurry of charges and countercharges related to alleged Chinese espionage at Los Alamos, there is, I think, a continuing problem confronted by U.S. counterintelligence in the post-Cold War period, absent reliable testimony by those who have renounced the other side of whatever country for our own side. The questions that remain to be answered concerning Soviet espionage in the United States and elsewhere, in other words, continue to overwhelm even the new evidence produced up to date by all of these books, my own included, which suggests that those of us responsible for these 4 books and for other recent studies of Russian espionage might be advised to retain an appropriate modesty about the conclusiveness of our still very early probes into the dramatis persona, the activities, and the significance of Soviet espionage. Now, let me confront directly, if briefly, one question often asked about my book and these others. What impact has the new research on Soviet espionage had on our understanding of McCarthyism, and specifically, does it justify what the person who wrote the Times Magazine headline called its rehabilitation, so-called? The answer is absolutely not, because among other factors, my own research and that of other recent scholars on the subject show that the Soviet spy networks closed down in the United States by 1946, right after the defection of Major Agent and Courier Elizabeth Bentley, who named names. Thus, by the time McCarthy began his efforts 4 years later, there were virtually no Soviet agents in the United States to be found, and were not for some time after that. The poet Marion Moore once described the writing of poetry as the creation of imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Now, that has a relevance to espionage because, in effect, Senator McCarthy and some of his investigative colleagues on the Hill created a variety of imaginary gardens of espionage. Yes, there were real toads. I've just named some of them. Yes, there were figures who betrayed their country. There were serious internal security issues, but these are, in any period, our own as well, far too important to be left to the zealots and the ideologues. Another question is whether those who would still defend American communism during that period accept the reality that at least some members of the Communist Party in this earlier generation worked as Soviet espionage agents, or do they continue to live in denial? Well, the best answer I can have is to ask them yourself. But from what has been published to date, some recent defenders of the Rosenberg's innocence, for example, have now conceded that Julius, at least, was an active agent, although it is hard to find anyone today, certainly not your speaker, who defends the couple's execution for whatever crimes they might have committed. Others on the left, like one scholar quoted by Mr. Weisberg in the Times, concede widespread espionage by communists in the 1930s and 40s, but defend the practice on the grounds that these people spied purportedly, and I'm quoting here, not because they were traitors, but because they did not subscribe to traditional forms of patriotism. This apologia for atomic espionage plumbs what might best be described as the lower depths of the higher law. Now, as serious Americans at the beginning of what may be a century at least as internationally dangerous as the one just ended, if in different ways and with different adversaries, can we wrap our minds around the notion that there exist real internal security issues, but do so without succumbing to demagogic hysteria about them? Can we deal, in short, in present and future with our real toads without constructing new imaginary gardens? And my answer is, why not, if we at least learned appropriately some of the lessons that I'm discussing here? One admitted major atomic spy, and I stress admitted atomic spy for the Soviets, Klaus Fuchs, once described the psyche of an espionage agent as involving controlled schizophrenia, which might be a useful concept for Americans to ponder in thinking about how best to confront in our own time those who betray the values of our democratic society, but in a manner which assures that we do not betray those values ourselves. Now, I'm often asked, and it's a nagging question for me as well, about motivation. Why did these folks spy? Of course, the mixture of motives will depend upon the individual involved, but most themselves pointed to their anti-fascist convictions, their communist or pro-communist orientations as decisive reasons, ideological reasons, in short, in the 1930s and 40s. But I want to share with you a brief passage from one of the finest explorations of this question that I know of. It comes from the novelist John Banville's 1997 book, The Untouchable, which some of you may have read, based on the career of the British art historian and key Soviet agent Anthony Blunt, the so-called fourth man or fifth man, depending on how you count, who worked with Philby, Burgess, McLean, and Cairncross, the so-called Cambridge ring of spies. This is Mr. Banville talking through the mind of his Blunt figure, whom he named Victor Masco in the novel. Perhaps it was not philosophy by which I lived, but the double life itself, which at first seemed to so many of us a source of strength, that acted upon me as a debilitating force. I know this has always been said of us, that the lying and the secrecy inevitably corrupted us, sapped our moral strength, and blinded us to the actual nature of things. But I never believed it could be true. We were latter-day Gnostics, keepers of a secret knowledge, for whom the world of appearances was only a gross manifestation of an infinitely subtler, more real reality known only to the chosen few, but the iron eluctable laws of which were everywhere at work. This gnosis was on the material level the equivalent of the Freudian conception of the unconscious, that unacknowledged and irresistible legislator, that spy in the heart. Thus, for us, everything was itself and at the same time something else. So we could rag about the place and drink all night and laugh ourselves silly because beyond all of our frivolity, there operated the stern conviction that the world must be changed and that we were the ones who would do it. At our lightest, we seemed to ourselves possessed of a seriousness far more deep, partly because it was hidden, than anything our parents could manage with their vaguenesses and lack of any certainty, any rigor, above all their contemptibly feeble efforts at being good. Let the whole sham fortress fall, we said, and if we can give it a good hard shove, we will. It was all selfishness, of course. We did not care a damn about the world, much as we might shout about freedom and justice and the plight of the masses. All selfishness. The fact is, the majority of us had no more than the sketchiest grasp of theory. We did not bother to read the text. We had others to do that for us. The working class comrades were the great readers. Communism could not have survived without autodidacts. I knew one or two of the shorter pieces, the manifesto, of course, that great ringing shout of wishful thinking, and had made a determined start on Kapital. The dropping of the definite article was de rigueur for us smart young men, so long as the pronunciation was echt Deutsch, but soon got bored. Politics, anyway, was not books. Politics was action. I'll leave you with that little passage from Banville and move on to my next subject. As I indicated in my opening comments, I want to address in my remaining time some broader issues removed from the espionage subject of this talk. I hope that is acceptable to you. Specifically, the question of what the United States has done and can still do to further the complex progress of democracy and the rule of law in what had been the KGB's country and now one hopefully is no longer, the post-KGB country in the Russian Federation. The small non-governmental center which I helped to found and still head 16 years later has been deeply involved in a range of efforts and programs related to the transformation in Russia, so this is much on my professional mind as well. Other than my own controlled schizophrenia, half of my life is spent running the center and the other half writing history, and one tries to keep those in their proper compartments. But I've traveled to Russia some 50 or 60 times in the past decade and have a few thoughts on that subject. It seems a fair statement, thinking of the Russian Federation alone in December 1991, which after a millennium of tyrannical rule suddenly found itself having dispensed with its Soviet constraints. It seems a fair statement that never in human history has a nation been asked simultaneously and with neither historical precedent nor preparation to reconstruct simultaneously, again I remind you, its political structure, its governmental system, its economic system, its legal system, its underlying approach to ethics, its relationships with the world, as occurred in Russia at that moment and continues to occur to the present. All changed, as the poet Yeats wrote about a far less complicated situation in Ireland in 1916. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born, applicable, I think, to Russia from 1991 onward. Virtually overnight, there was some forewarning because of the collapse of the Soviet Union's Eastern European Empire in the preceding 2 years. The Cold War gave way to the post-Cold War era. Abruptly for American policymakers and the public, the gracious, familiarly genial Soviet leadership style of Mikhail Gorbachev gave way to the unfamiliar and unpredictable Russian cadences of Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin and his colleagues, laying before us a suddenly pro-Western menu of policies and actions. And this change was neither easy nor initially comfortable for the Bush administration, and obviously it was not for Gorbachev and his colleagues. I happened to be in Moscow the day before this happened on one of my visits and had lunch at the Foreign Ministry with the then Deputy Foreign Minister, who urged me to persuade my friends in the Yeltsin camp to let the Soviet Union die a more leisurely death over the next several years as best for the country. It was odd to be an American messenger of this, but it turned out that evening at dinner, for those of you who read David Remnick's book have heard the story already, I was having dinner with my friend Andrei Kozrev, the foreign minister then of the Russian Federation, who already knew about this effort on the part of people to persuade President Yeltsin not to move quickly. But rather than respond to my comments about my luncheon meeting, he flipped out a notebook and turned to me and said over dinner, "Tell me, Professor, tell me the difference between a commonwealth, an association, and a confederation." And as you know, the following day in Minsk, President Yeltsin and his colleagues from Ukraine and Belarus created the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States and declared the Soviet Union at an end. It was a very odd experience to boot, and I think one that for many Russians remains complex in terms of their loyalties and their sense of what they want this new country to be. We certainly could not have predicted it. And from almost the moment that the new realities took shape, however, we attempted as best we could to at least be generous and supportive. The United States and Western Europe responded generously during those earlier years of the 1990s with emergency aid, with food, with medicines, with basic supplies, with emergency loans. But none of the Western democracies, ourselves included, took a lead in organizing in cooperation with the Yeltsin government a coherent plan for initiating and implementing the staggering process of transforming that command economy into serious market structures capable of managing large-scale privatization or of creating a post-communist class of genuine entrepreneurs and managers. Perhaps that was too much to expect, and I'm not going to review all the complications that both the Bush and the Clinton administration have faced in this process. I would suggest, however, that whatever, and there have been achievements here, but whatever mistakes of omission or commission have been committed in our policies toward Russia from 1991 to the present by both administrations, that it may be helpful, it will be helpful, if those in charge of U.S. policy today, I think they can do their successors a great final service by producing in the closing months of this administration for use by either President Gore or President Bush, whoever becomes president, a comprehensive white paper outlining what was done in detail, what seems useful, and in retrospect, what neither worked nor was helpful, and what guidelines for a new bipartisan policy toward Russia they might commend to their successors, and I stress bipartisan, and I'll come back to that point. Now, we don't have time in the few minutes remaining to me to do a program-by-program assessment of this process and of the difficulties faced in the 1990s of providing serious assistance to the Russian government and the Russian people. But I think it's important to remember that neither Presidents Bush nor Clinton had received from the American electorate in their either in 1988 or 1992 or 96, nor for that matter had they requested a mandate to engage in long-term, extensive, and sustained assistance to the Russian government of the sort that Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had received in supporting economic aid programs related to U.S. national security during the Cold War era. beginning, of course, with our Greek-Turkish aid program and the Marshall Plan, and continuing through Point 4 and other programs. In fact, it's important to remember that the 1992 and 96 elections might arguably be called our first presidential contest since 1936, which were fought without an overriding foreign policy question involved. So that it is probably fair to say that the United States and other Western countries were simply, or have been simply, unprepared in their electorates, intellectually and financially, for the challenges of a post-communist Russia, and to some extent we remain unprepared today. However, in the 8 years that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been an extraordinary range of intergovernmental, governmental, and private assistance programs related to encouraging the development of democratic institutions, civil society, and the rule of law in Russia today. And these programs, a number of them have been extraordinarily helpful. The flaws in the programs were outlined, or some of the programs, in a very pointed and impressive article by George Soros, who's contributed significantly funding to a number of these programs, in a recent article in the New York Review of Books that some of you may have read, and in other forums. But we don't have time to review the problems and the like. What might be more useful, in my few remaining moments, is, first of all, to stipulate a tribute to all of those friends of Russia abroad, whether governmental or non-governmental, who have struggled to support the monumentally difficult range of problems confronting their nascent democratizing country, problems ranging from the imbalance of power among the branches of the Russian national government, the president's too powerful, the legislature's too deferential, the judicial branch is not fully effective yet, to the unresolved contest over authority that we're witnessing in the media today as we read about it day by day between the central government and the governors of the different provinces, to the Russian government's often hostile relationship toward free and unfettered media, as in the case of the police raid on the major independent television network NTV recently, which one hopes will not be repeated, toward the indifference of government toward independent non-governmental organizations. My environmentalist friends found that the State Committee on Environmental Protection was simply abolished by President Putin about a week ago. You may have seen the story in the newspapers. There are many, many problems of this kind. One is well aware, I'm well aware, and I think all of us are, with the half-empty nature of the Russian democratization glass today. However, just as many of us, myself included, were undoubtedly too optimistic a decade ago about the pace of democratization in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, are we not perhaps a shade too pessimistic about that process today? Because I think most Russians would concede that there will be no going back to any communist Russia, and there have been a number of successes in a variety of areas that we can talk about later if you'd like. But I do have some suggestions for future support for that country that I want to outline briefly before concluding and taking questions. First of all, it would be helpful, I think, in future if we thought of assistance to Russia as multilateral, not unilateral. One of the saddest, if little noticed, elements in limiting the impact of foreign assistance on Russian democratization programs, the ones that I'm particularly concerned with, has been the uncoordinated and unilateral nature of much of this aid at the governmental and intergovernmental levels. In brief, agencies of the U.S. government have supported our programs, USAID and others. The European Union have supported its programs, the German government, its programs, and so forth. More often than not only was there no coordination of these overlapping programs, but there was not even cooperation, and in many instances not even communication amongst Americans and Europeans working the same terrain in Russia. And I don't exempt our non-governmental organizations from this same process. And if nothing else, we certainly can provide for ways, using the computer, of keeping one another informed on what each of us is doing and seeing if we can indeed cooperate with one another in future and maximize the impact of our assistance. Secondly, increase the human exchanges. This is a no-brainer, and one whose importance cannot be overestimated. Exchange programs that have brought thousands and are now bringing tens of thousands of Russians from throughout the country, from throughout the range of professions, to democratic societies to observe the operations of such societies in Europe, in the United States, even in Asia. These are arguably the most cost-effective instruments for educating that country's citizens in the economic and political potential of a democratic Russia. They deserve all the governmental and private support possible. Support for media. During an election monitoring visit to Russia on my part of the Center for Democracy election monitoring group several weeks ago, one of my oldest friends there, now a media executive, formerly in the Yeltsin government, argued that the best service the United States government and society could perform for Russian democracy today is to make it plain in the strongest terms to Russia's new leaders, including its president, what type of behavior the community of democracies found acceptable and which actions crossed the line, nowhere more urgently than in the pressures that President Putin and his colleagues apparently wish to exert on constraining the freedom of the media, both domestic and foreign, in that country. I think I've said something about this already. In that connection, I would add also supporting the freedom of non-governmental organizations, whether environmental or human rights or legal organizations, to pursue their efforts, hopefully with government support, but certainly without government opposition. We have to also begin leaving Moscow and St. Petersburg and the other major cities to do more of what we want to do in the regions of Russia. The bulk of foreign support for Russia, economically as well as on democratization, has been concentrated inevitably in the cities, in the major cities, and in the period ahead, I think all of us who are involved in this effort agree that more of this support should go into the regions. Increasing rule of law cooperation with Russia's judicial branch is absolutely critical, and I can go into detail later, but I'm running out of time if we're going to have time for questions, so I won't go into those measures. But for example, the Russian Supreme and Supreme Arbitration Courts, that is to say their major commercial court, the leaders of this are creating a Russian judicial academy comparable to those judicial academies in Western countries, and we ought to support this to the fullest with the resources that will help train the judges and train the lawyers in Russia in a way that brings them into coordination with the broader European and global legal standards of organizations such as the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Union. The U.S. government is really in the back seat here because Russia is, after all, a European country, but we should help in every way we can. Bring the politicians here. There are wonderful programs going on. The Library of Congress has an excellent one now, bringing groups from the Russian Duma and Federal Council here. Those should be expanded and supported, which brings me perhaps to my final 2 points in this regard. I think it's critical when the president returns. Some of us would have preferred that a bipartisan delegation from Congress accompany him, but when he returns, that we really address the task of restoring a bipartisan consensus on American policy toward Russia under the Putin government. I think the lead here has to be taken by the leaders of Congress, the Republican leadership of Congress, and by President Clinton, and one hopes when he returns that there will be an effort to assure that whomever becomes president this year, that bipartisanship returns as a fundamental element in our policy toward Russia. I say that not only because I lead a bipartisan center with our directors coming from both parties, but because it's absolutely critical, so that one party does not play another off on who is responsible for this and who is responsible for that. And finally, it seems to me that we have to recognize that we can only do so much, that the United States is not, in fact, in a position to affect each and every aspect of the internal democratization process in Russia, that ultimately it is up to the Russian people themselves as to what they will put up with and what they would not. I always remind my Russian friends that if they want a lesson in what the limits are of being only 10 years out of your independence moment, check the United States in 1786 and see what we had done and what we had not done, and use that perhaps as a measurement for what you've achieved and what you haven't yet achieved, and don't be too demoralized by what remains to come. I'll stop there, except historians are always, there are lessons to be learned in this process of what went right and what has gone wrong in our relationship with Russia. What's gone right from my perspective is for several years, among other things, the KGB archives were open to a historian such as myself, and I managed to get a book out of this, which I'm proud of and which I hope you will enjoy reading, which is why we're allegedly here today, before I started talking more generally about Russia. But historians are always talking about lessons and the lessons they've learned. I don't have the time to talk about some of the ones I've learned, but certainly in connection with the rise and fall of democracies, one has to keep in mind that one thing leads to another. The law of unintended consequences is always supreme. But there's another one, and that's my favorite one in this regard, which is the law of surprises. If you'd been in Washington in 19 even in 1988 or 1989, and we'd been having this conversation, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, in 2 years, within 2 years, the entire communist structure and system in Central and Eastern Europe will have collapsed, unraveled. The Federal Republic of Germany will absorb East Germany. The other countries of the Central Europe will become free and independent again, and there will be no Soviet Union. What would you have done? You know what you have done. You would have laughed at me. You would have said, that's ridiculous and that's absurd. But we were, in fact, in the 1980s still predicting that we would have to deal with the communist system in a set of intractable spheres. I remember that doctrine, which came out of a State Department figure who shall remain nameless at this particular moment. Well, the intractable became the very tractable, and I suspect that can happen again. So there's room for optimism if we will provide the kind of support that our Russian friends need in the period ahead, and also make it clear what we will not accept as from a state which purports to be a fellow democratic society. If we keep those interests clear, I think we should have some very interesting times ahead of us, and not too bad as a period. And I'll stop there and take questions, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor. We do have some time for questions from the audience.
Last year, Tony Hiss, the son of Alger Hiss, spoke from the same podium.
Right.
He predicted that when further former Soviet archives are open, that there may be details that would alter the recent revelations about his father's case. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Happy to. Some of you may recall a gentleman named General Volkoganov, who was approached by people related to the defense of Mr. Hiss after the changeover from the Soviet Union to Russia. And General Volkoganov was then working steadily in the archives in a number of projects, and he was asked to see if there was any material there on Alger Hiss. He went to his friend, then Director Primakov, and he went into the KGB archives, which is the archive he was asked to look at. Although Whittaker Chambers had indicated that Alger Hiss did not work for the KGB, he worked for Russian military intelligence, which is a quite separate archive which has not been opened. He then wrote Mr. Hiss's attorneys a letter saying that he found nothing that indicated Mr. Hiss had worked for the Soviets, and he wished him well. Used in the press, ballyhooed in the press, it might be said, a great deal as the, quote, exoneration, unquote, of Alger Hiss. If you want a full account of this, check the last chapter of the new edition of Perjury, which was published in paperback about 1.5 years or 2 ago. General Volkoganov was forced to retract that statement when it was pointed out that he had not made a thorough search of even the KGB archives, spent a day or two there, and that he had not looked at the military archives where the Hiss files have presumably been kept. What does one say about release of the archives? When I was phoned by a reporter for the New York Times asking what I felt about General Volkoganov's initial statement, I said very honestly what any historian would say, well, that reopens the case. I began my research into this case under the premise that Mr. Hiss was probably innocent, and changed my mind in the course of doing my research, and threw away a good portion of a book already written because it was not the book supported by the evidence. Can historians change their minds on this? Of course, but what I found in the KGB archives were bits and pieces, and there's some evidence in Venona as well, but in the KGB archives it reinforced the involvement of Mr. Hiss even in the 1930s. They weren't supposed to be there, but he was talking to agents of who were working for the KGB, what was then the predecessor agency of the KGB, and so there were various citations to Mr. Hiss that reinforced the case for his involvement that can be found studied throughout the new edition, or the edition of The Haunted Wood. And what you may want to do, if you haven't had a chance to do it, is to take a look at the references to Alger Hiss and The Haunted Wood and see if they provide any insight. But as far as Tony Hiss's statement, we're all slaves of the future. We'll have to wait to see what happens. But for the moment, I've seen nothing to change my initial analysis of the thing, except to believe. So I was an agnostic as to whether Alger Hiss had remained a Soviet agent during the war. When I first wrote Perjury in the 1970s, based on the new material, I'm persuaded that he did remain a Soviet agent right up to his departure from the State Department.
you advocated war exchange programs. How do you square that with evidence that countries like China have used that with students and scientists working over here as a major part of their espionage efforts against the United States for such things as technology transfer?
Well, I think squaring that is not a problem for me, because for one thing, you don't have to take exchange scholars or researchers into the heart of your secret efforts in order to have a decent exchange program. This has never been the case. Possibly, although we don't always consider it as such, possibly the most successful exchange program ever run in the history of the world was the Fulbright program, which brought to the United States over a period of, since it was initiated after the Second World War, thousands upon thousands of, I think even hundreds of thousands of people from the range of countries around the world, which created, in effect, for the most part, groups of extremely influential figures in virtually every country in the world who understood America. They didn't have to agree with us on everything, our government's policies, but they were implicitly understanding, compassionate, and supportive of our efforts as a democratic society. In connection with Russia, that's having some of the same effect and has over the past 10 years. In connection with China, which you've mentioned, and I suppose you could mention other countries in terms of these exchange of similar concerns about the national security elements, one, in effect, can be cautious as to where people go and be very careful as to what they're not getting into, but also keep in mind what's happening in China today. Keep in mind the dramatic pace of personal change in China. Keep in mind what's happening as a result of the computer, the widespread use of computers and the internet and the like, and economic activity. One can almost imagine this situation in China as a kind of race to the future between retrograde forces, perhaps some in their military, perhaps some in their intelligence services, who knows where else, and others in Chinese society, including a number of their leaders, who see a different kind of China. I don't say they see a democratic China yet, but we are certainly over the next 10 or 20 years going to see which of those societies manages, which of those leadership cadres manages to hold sway in China, and it's to our interest to assure that a leadership more committed to an open China, an open society, has whatever encouragement we can provide them without being stupid about our own national security. As I said, one of the dilemmas we faced as a country is that I don't think we've ever had, I don't disagree with most people in the intelligence community as far as I read about them in the Washington Post and elsewhere. They seem to share the notion that our counterintelligence efforts could be beefed up. So those should be beefed up.
How did you assure yourself that the documents you were being given to look at by the Russians were authentic, and were you able to deal with them in Russian, or did you rely on translators and interpreters?
No, as I said in The Haunted Wood, it's all very clear. The deal made with the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service that Random House concluded said that Western authors were not allowed into the archives. The Russian authors dealt with we could make our requests, but the Russian authors were the ones who dealt with it. It's all in the introduction to The Haunted Wood, which I commend to you. But how do we assure their authenticity? Well, there are a variety of ways. One of which is the fact that I in fact, looked at a number of those documents with Russian translator friends there. I don't speak Russian, I don't read Russian, but, which is also in the introduction to The Haunted Wood, but that in most instances these documents had not been even opened in 20, 30, or 40 years, or since the time that they had been produced. The Russians have a fascinating system for that period. They probably changed it in the 1960s and 70s when they began reading Western management books, or maybe, I don't know, maybe CIA manuals or something. But documents were sewn together. So you'd open a folio. This is with string, with hard string. You'd open a folio, and there would be a report from the Russian station chief in New York on what he'd been doing, or in Washington, next to a letter from a communist steelworker giving $5 to Comrade Stalin to be used in whatever fashion he wanted to use it, after which there would be things that were obviously irrelevant to the historian and things that were quite relevant, with a signing sheet as to who had used this material from the beginning. What nailed down for not only my own book, but for several of the other books, the authenticity issue was, well, first of all, the authenticity issue was nailed down by the very sheer complexity of what emerged. No, they didn't have a group of people. Some of the material I got only because my co-author left Russia under threat. That's pretty authentic to me when the archivists and the archives say that once Zyganov wins the election, which they did in 1996, you know, we'll deal with you, and we'll deal with the others who are working with the Westerners now. But when the Venona documents were released, and you found the same cable, essentially being transcribed, deciphered and transcribed by our intelligence people in Washington, as you found in Moscow, you'll notice in the footnotes to the Haunted Wood, once I hope you have a chance to look at it, you'll notice there are about 50 or 60 citations in which I quote a document taken from the Moscow archives, then I quote the American the same document as emerging from Venona, and finally, in exasperation, my editor said, "For God's sakes, you know, the company doesn't have the money to let you do all of this," and so I just stopped. But I've done it for a number of others as well. But authenticity is always a problem for the historian, and in this instance, I think I'm persuaded that there are no problems here. Among other things, it cost my collaborator his ability to live in Russia. That's pretty authentic to me.
Final question,
There's been stories that Martha Dodd, when she was living in Berlin, had affairs, perhaps intimate affairs, with a number of American personalities who were visiting Berlin at 1936 for the Olympics, including like the American writer Thomas Wook. Did you ever come across anything in the documentation about her contacts with the Soviet intelligence service, of her trying to attempt to turn any of these people?
Well, short answer is no, but let me tell the rest of the audience who we're talking about. The gentleman was asking about a fascinating woman. I gather there are several books coming out on her, so you'll be able to know much more about her soon, named Martha Dodd, who was the daughter of Ambassador William Dodd, the U.S. ambassador to Nazi Germany during the first Roosevelt term, 33 to 37. A fine historian and a very close personal friend, as his entire family was, of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. So that Ambassador Dodd would write not through state, but he'd communicate quite often directly to the White House and to the president. Martha Dodd was young, extremely bright, very restless, very glamorous, very attractive, and she immediately plunged into German Berlin society at the time and began a variety of love affairs, one of which was with a Soviet diplomat named Vinogradov, with whom she fell deeply in love and agreed. He was soon under the control of Russian intelligence, of Soviet intelligence at the time, and she agreed to become an agent, which meant that she was taking documents from her father's desk or talking to people in the embassy and conveying information and whatnot to the Soviets. The story becomes very complicated, and she seems to have also had love affairs with German generals and with a variety of others, and the Soviets were forever, the Soviet operatives were forever troubled about what they always felt was the promiscuity of their American agents. They didn't like it one bit. This is a very puritanical culture, and they had one head of a spy ring during the Second World War, Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, who was living in a menage a trois with another agent, and that deeply troubled them. And in Martha Dodd's case, they were fit to be tied, and she went to Moscow. She wanted to marry this Soviet fellow. In the end, he fell victim to the purge years, and he was executed. But that fact was kept from her for a while because they hoped to continue using her. When she returned to the United States, however, her relationships with the Roosevelts were not anywhere near as close. Once her father had left the embassy, she became a very of minor importance to the Soviet operatives in the United States, and eventually was more or less cut adrift. She fled the country under congressional subpoena. She and her husband, who was also a communist activist, fled the United States in the 1950s and moved about in a rather sad, almost tragic way from Moscow, where they weren't comfortable, to Prague, to Cuba, to this place, that place, and she never returned. She died abroad. By then she'd been indicted in the United States, but the heyday of Martha Dodd and her involvement with the Soviets was in the 1930s, from 1933 to 37. And once again, it brings home another lesson of engaging in this kind of history. You're all familiar with the names Alger Hiss, and you're all familiar with the names of the Rosenbergs and so forth. But And again, just to make a point about the Rosenbergs, because it was a question that somebody had asked me earlier and was going to ask here if we'd had time, we found no evidence that Ethel Rosenberg was anything more than just a witting wife, knew what her husband was doing. We found no evidence that she was actively engaged, nor did the Soviets, in certain memos they sent back and forth, find any, or a claim that she was an active agent. Her husband was, but not her. But in the case of Martha Dodd and the others, you're dealing with human stories. You're dealing with stories that often, when the climate in the United States changed, became human tragedies. And so one engages in this kind of research and this kind of history with whomever, whether one considers them guilty of something or innocent of something, one engages respectfully because they are ultimately human beings like the rest of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the crew and staff from Book TV for joining us today. We still do have a few copies of the book available for sale outside, and Dr. Weinstein will join us and sign copies as well. Thank you all for coming. Well, look at the audience you bring in on a beautiful spring day, sir.
Well, I really appreciate it.
Yes.
Act has raced to catch up. Specifically, our basic understanding of Cold War espionage in the United States and England has deepened with publication over the year and a half just past, of 4 overlapping books, each filling in a significant aspect of the research landscape. Their co-authors include 3 Americans, 3 Russians, and 2 Englishmen. The latest of these, The Sword and the Shield, written by Cambridge historian Christopher Andrew and former KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, drew major news stories with details about yet another Soviet agent working on atomic energy matters during World War II, in this case an 87-year-old Englishwoman who promptly acknowledged her involvement in the process. Andrew is a prolific scholar of modern intelligence, best known for a previous book on KGB history written with an earlier defector, Oleg Gordievsky, and he used in this current volume several thousand items copied over the years from the KGB archives by Mr. Mitrokhin before his retirement in 1984, material which he brought to England where he sought asylum. Another previously secret cache of documents, this one from American intelligence sources, was used skillfully in John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare's book Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America, as well as in the Weinstein-Vasiliev book. Clare and Haynes identified over 300 Soviet agents and sources in the United States during the 1930s and 40s, using the deciphered transcriptions of World War II Soviet intelligence cables assigned at the time the project name Venona, whose documents were released finally by the CIA and the NSA in 1995 and 96. A third study, published here last March by espionage expert Nigel West and another former KGB official, Oleg Sarov, called The Crown Jewels, the British Secrets at the Heart of the KGB Archives, was mainly focused on to use the entire hour in my prepared comments and to leave as much time as possible for questions or, for all I know, your prepared comments, whatever that may be. How did one come to write a book on Soviet espionage in the United States during this period? I could take all hour with a description of that, but the simplified version is that in 1993, my publisher, Random House, came to an agreement with the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, which was then headed by Yevgeny Primakov, who went on to become Foreign Minister and briefly Prime Minister of Russia, and purchased rights to access for several books to be done jointly by Western historians and Russians. In the case of my co-author, he was a former agent of the KGB who became a journalist, Alexander Vasiliev. Now, why did the KGB or the former KGB folks sell access to at least some access to their archives to an American publisher? I think most of you are familiar with the famous Willie Sutton line about robbing banks, because that's where the money is, and they needed the money very badly at that time. But it turned into an extremely interesting 2-year research experience in Moscow until those archives were again closed. It involved a number of meetings with Mr. Primakov and with various Soviet agents of an earlier period about which we can talk later, perhaps. First question, why the title? The phrase, "The Haunted Wood," comes from a well-known poem by W.H. Auden, September 1, 1939, in which the relevant lines are these: "All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home. lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night who have never been happy or good. I use the title for this book because it seemed to encapsulate the moral confusions of many Americans who, fueled by romantic anti-fascist and pro-communist convictions, became spies for the Soviet Union, believing in a number of cases that they were not necessarily betraying their own country in doing so. This issue of Soviet espionage has, in recent months, again, fueled a certain amount of public debate. Some of you are familiar with a long article by Jacob Weisberg in a late November '99 issue of the New York Times Magazine under the heading "The Rehabilitation of Joe McCarthy," in which he describes a continuing debate among scholars over the nature and meaning of Soviet espionage in America during the Depression and World War II. This article, I'll refer to some of the issues raised in this article. Recent studies by historians, often based on previously secret U.S. and Soviet intelligence files, have rekindled debate, in short, over interpreting those issues. At a similar moment in the life of Soviet scholarship a decade ago, at a meeting in Moscow of Russian and American historians in which I chaired the U.S. side, this was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, one young Russian scholar whispered to me about the manner in which his colleagues were confronting new Western scholarship, which shattered their earlier Cold War shibboleths. "You know, I live in a remarkable country, Alan. We can predict the future and understand the present perfectly, but the past keeps changing every day." The end of the Cold War has brought a significant measure of new evidence and reconsideration to the subject I want to cover today. So let me begin with some comments not only about my own book, but about this new history of Soviet espionage, as it has been called. Now, spy fiction always floods the literary marketplace, but in the past year, spy fact.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sam Anthony, and I am the director of the author lecture program here. On behalf of the Archivists of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to the National Archives and Records Administration. We are honored today to have with us Dr. Alan Weinstein as he will discuss his book, The Haunted Wood, Soviet Espionage in America, the Stalin Era. A few points before we begin. Copies of the book will be for sale outside in the hallway. Following today's lecture, Dr. Weinstein will be signing copies of his book. If we have time, I believe we will, following his lecture, we will have a question and answer session with the audience. If you would like to have our calendar of events mailed to your home, there is a sign-up sheet also outside where books are being sold. We do still have some free calendars for June, also at the entrance of the theater. Well, why don't we get started? Historian Alan Weinstein is founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Democracy, a nonprofit foundation created in 1985 to promote and strengthen the democratic process. It's based in Washington, D.C. His international awards include the United Nations Peace Medal for efforts to promote peace, dialogue, and free elections in several critical parts of the world, the Council of Europe's Silver Medal twice in 1990 and 96, presented by its Parliamentary Assembly for outstanding assistance and guidance over many years. He was a university professor and professor of history at Boston University from 1985 to 1989, and he was university professor at Georgetown from 1981 to 1984. From 1966 to 1981, he was professor of history at Smith College and chairman of its American Studies program. Professor Weinstein's books include The Haunted Wood, the Hiss Chambers case, which received several citations, including the American Book Award nomination, Freedom and Crisis in American History, Between the Wars, American Foreign Policy from Versailles to Pearl Harbor, and Prelude to Populism, Origins of the Silver Issue. Would you please welcome Dr. Alan Weinstein.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony. I would just make one slight correction. The title of the Hiss Chambers book is Perjury, the Hiss Chambers Case. I want to thank the National Archives for inviting me to speak today, the latest in a series of programs here in which I've had the good fortune to be involved over the years. and I want to thank all of you for coming today, especially since the book I will be discussing for a portion of this hour is not hot off the press, but rather recently published in its paperback edition by Modern Library. So much of what I have to say may already be known to some of you. The timing of this talk about a book on Soviet espionage in the United States, however, has something to be said for itself. A former KGB officer now rules Russia by popular election. The President of the United States today or tomorrow is en route to Moscow to spend a weekend with the Russian president. And those who opened your Washington Post this morning found a lead editorial on U.S. policy toward Russia and a lead op-ed piece by a distinguished Russian media executive on threats to freedom of the media in that country, about all of which I will have something to say before the hour is over. And finally, I'll try to discipline myself not to